You're listening to the Future Tech Health Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Until I reached age 40, I never realized the obvious, that we all have medical issues, or we at least have a family member or close relation that had, has, or will have them in the future. Medicine and biological systems are the final frontier. Until we've conquered death, figured out how life began, cured cancer, and understood our purpose in the universe, there's a heck of a lot to talk about when it comes to our health. Future Tech Health means I'll be covering futuristic topics that are actually already in clinical trials, or even starting to appear on shelves or by prescription, or available for your own use. We dive deep into stem cells, CRISPR-Cas9, the science of sleep, epigenetics, medical testing, cancer, ketogenic diets, stem cells, aging, regenerative medicine, and more. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a serious medical problem. Remember, however, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you enjoy the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and share it with friends. Thank you. Hello, this is Richard Jacobs for the Future Tech and Future Tech Health podcast. I have Eric Weiner. He's the author of a book called The Geography of Genius. So it looks to be a very interesting title. So Eric, welcome. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well. Happy to be here, Richard.
Yeah, so what is the Geography of Genius about?
It's basically the notion that we've been thinking about genius all wrong. We have these myths surrounding a word like genius, and I would say myth number one is that geniuses are born. Think of Mozart, for instance. We assume that since he was, such a prodigy, playing violin at age 3, composing by age 7, surely he was born with these gifts, but, that ignores the fact that he was born into a very musical family in a very musical time in a very musical place in, Austria of the 18th century. So I really don't think genetics plays as big a role as we think. Myth number two is that, genius is made through hard work. And, again, it's partially true. Just like genetics play a role, hard work plays a role too. You've probably heard of the 10,000-hour rule, the idea that you have to put in at least 10,000 hours work to achieve mastery of a subject, if not genius level. Right. But, there are lots of hardworking people in North Korea with good genes, but you don't see a lot of geniuses coming out. So what I propose in my book is that there's a third theory of genius that we've largely overlooked, and it's that geniuses aren't born or made, but they're grown in the soil, and we've sort of ignored the role that environment and that place and that culture plays in the making of a genius.
Okay, so well, I guess there's nature versus nurture. There's always that eternal argument, but this is, I guess, nature of a different sort, right? Or is it a combination?
It's a variation of it, but we're so enamored of this myth of the lone genius, as if they just popped up like sort of like shooting stars. Like you don't know there might be one in the night sky, but when there is, it's miraculous, and you just have to wait for the next one. But it doesn't work that way. In fact, if you were to plot the appearance of geniuses throughout history and around the world, you would not see just random points, one in La Paz, Bolivia, and one in London and one in New Delhi. You would see these groupings, what I call genius clusters. And the fact of the matter is that certain places at certain times have produced just an inordinate number of brilliant minds and good ideas. And what I set out to do on this adventure, and it is partly a travel book, is to go back to these places, to travel back in time in a way and try to figure out what was in the water in these places, and can we bottle it? Are there lessons for us today?
Okay. So, what have you found? What kind of places did you go to? Let's start with that. What are some?
Well, I identified 7 from chronologically from ancient Athens to Silicon Valley, right? And including, some expected places like Renaissance Florence. Most people know about that. But less expected ones like Vienna of the turn of the century, around 1900, and Hangzhou, China, in the 12th and 13th century, and even Calcutta in the late 19th, early 20th centuries was definitely a place of genius. So yeah, and I went to these places because, I'm a place person, and I cannot really know a subject unless I go to the heart of it. And we still do this today. I mean, you can look at all the great artwork of the Renaissance online, but yet people go to Florence and they put up with the long queues at the Uffizi Museum and the crowds and the heat because they want to see it in person, and they want to walk in the steps of Michelangelo and Leonardo. Right. And that's what I do, combined with an awful lot of time spent in the library and researching the subject of geniusology.
So what did you find? Did you get a feeling from the places you went to, or was it just like any other place?
Well, I mean, they have a few things in common and a few things not in common. There's not it's not an exact recipe. If there was an exact recipe for sort of creating one of these genius clusters, well, I wouldn't be talking to you because I'd be on my yacht somewhere in the Mediterranean if I'd figured that one out. But they're more a set of ingredients, I would say, in different proportions. And one thing that almost all of them have in common is that they are cities. If you think about it, all that you don't hear of any geniuses really becoming geniuses in small towns and rural areas. They may be born there, but eventually, almost always, they'll move to a city. And why cities? I think a couple reasons. One is simply because that's where the people are. That's where the jury is. I believe deeply that genius is a social verdict. That we decide who a genius is, and that's why you see some people like Van Gogh and Bach who were not that highly regarded in their time because the jury, the people of the time, didn't think they were so hot. But 75, 100 years later, they become geniuses. So you need a city because you need people to say, hey, that guy Richard is really brilliant. His podcast is just total genius. And the second reason is what researchers call interaction opportunities. A better way of phrasing it is that cities are where ideas go to have sex, that they're interacting with one another. And when you have ideas bumping up against each other and rubbing against each other, and that's as far as I'll go with that metaphor, some unexpected and wonderful things happen. You have new compounds forming, new ideas forming. So in a city, you're more likely to encounter ideas outside of your comfort zone and more likely to encounter other people attacking maybe the same problem from a different angle. And it's these interaction opportunities combined with some other things, I think, that explains why if it takes a village to raise a child, it takes a city to make a genius.
I guess you could do similar works on, the geography of violence and the geography of many other things. Since you like places, maybe that would be subjects for future books. You visit places of great strife and maybe try to identify why they happen there, et cetera. I know that's
what I examine is an idea. And in the geography, my book, Geography of Bliss, I look at different ways that different countries pursue happiness and define happiness and what we can learn from them. And so it is the intersection of place and idea that interests me. For me, places are the embodiment of ideas. You don't just feel love, for instance, anywhere. You feel it for a certain person, but also in a certain place. And at a certain time. And we are much more creatures of place than we think, even today in the information age, the digital age. In fact, in a strange way, geography matters even more in the digital age than it did before. I mean, it's remarkably persistent because if you think about it, Silicon Valley should not exist, right? Here is these people telling us that they're creating these devices, iPhones and ways of communicating like we're doing right now, where you can be anywhere, right? You can be anywhere. But yet the people who are telling us you can be anywhere, the vast majority of them live in one 60-mile stretch of land between San Francisco and San Jose, California, otherwise known as Silicon Valley. So place still very much matters today.
Well, it's an old expression that people make the place. So I know you've been looking at the geography of genius, but maybe most of the context in which genius develops is invisible to you because they weren't the same people around at the same time, and
no, I mean, yes, obviously, there was a British writer whose name escapes me who said famously that the past is a foreign country. They do things differently there. And that's very true. And the challenge for a writer like myself is to go to these places, and the Athens of today is very different from the Athens of 400 BC, and imagine it as it was back then, to look for portholes to the past. And it is the confluence of time and place that matters. And you said it's the people that make the place. Yes and no. On one level, that's true, but it's also the place that makes the people. In other words, it's something about, first of all, the reaction to the land and the topography. In ancient Greece, you had hundreds and hundreds of these city-states that were really like countries. Athens was a city, but it was a city-state, meaning that it really was what we consider a small country today. And you had hundreds of these throughout Greece at the time, and they were separated by the mountains and the land and the difficulty of travel. So you had all these micro-cultures sprouting up, like hundreds of little petri dishes. And each one sort of excelled at something different. The Spartans were good at warfare. The Athenians, less so, but they brought us democracy and theater, and we don't remember the Spartans so much today, do we?
So any other interesting things that jumped out at you? Were there particular places you went to that?
I would say this about the places. They were surprising. They were surprising in that they were not nice places. By that, I mean they were not paradise. And if paradise does exist, it's probably the least creative place in the world because you need some tension to create. And in fact, Athens, just to use it again as an example, at the time was a dirty, smelly place, even by the standards of the day. Edinburgh, during its age of enlightenment in the 18th, 19th centuries, was a pretty dirty, smelly place also, and small, actually, too. And the Scots were great underdogs, I mean, they'd just been conquered by the English. And yet you had this flourishing where you had Adam Smith, the founder of modern economics, and David Hume, the great philosopher, and I could go on, in this kind of backwater, really. But they had something to prove. They had a chip on their shoulder, which helps. And they had this intermingling of people from different classes. In a building in Edinburgh in the 18th century, you might have people from all kinds of different backgrounds living in the same apartment building. And it's these kind of interactions of differently minded people with different ideas that's really important because there's a kind of creativity contagion that takes place. If you live near a creative person, you're more likely to be creative yourself, even if you don't know that person, which I know sounds weird, but there's a multiplier effect. And once there is a breakthrough in one field, you tend to see breakthroughs in others. I'll give you an example. Let's go to Vienna of 1900. So there you've got, say you're Sigmund Freud, and you're just some young doctor with some crazy ideas about the unconscious, and no one knows you. But you look around, you see all these breakthroughs in art with Gustav Klimt, and in physics and politics, and you think, well, why not my field too? On some level, you think that. So there's a kind of contagion in a good way that takes place in these places.
Yeah, I guess it's not just the genius, but what happens in the wake of the genius. Maybe in their wake, more things sprout up. Maybe it's just the, have you ever studied, like you said, this contagion, like when, I know it's a very different topic, but a lot of hip hop originated in New York, in certain very small neighborhoods in Queens and the Bronx and everything. And it's funny, even certain apartment complexes that just seem to be like an epicenter, for instance, of hip hop. So it's weird that certain things are like hyper local and they tend to arise, and then they keep that locality for a long time. It's strange, that effect.
Right. And it's not that different. I mean, hip hop is a creative art form that sprang out of a particular culture. I mean, it would not have sprung out of Renaissance Florence. And I argue that, if you take one of these hip hop artists and you put them in a different time and place, they're not going to be genius hip hop artists. And if you take Leonardo da Vinci and you plop him in, Brooklyn of the 21st century, he's not going to be the genius that we know and love today. Who knows? Maybe he'd become a hip hop star. It's possible.
Well, I was seeing, like culture, like I grew up in New York, and I saw like, a lot of the businesses were owned by particular ethnicities, and ethnicities cluster, So maybe this is the same type of effect. Like, over the past, I don't know, probably 8 or 10 years, all the cab drivers seem to be from Ethiopia and Somalia.
Mm-hmm.
And like I said, historically in New York, all the nail salons were Korean and all of this was that. I guess it's just clustering both, like you said, when a field is advancing or ancillary fields are advancing or a culture's there or I don't know.
Yeah,
like
but the thing is, you've got, in order for a place, in my mind, to qualify as a real genius cluster, sparks have to be flying in lots of different directions. So, just like a one crop economy is not a great bet, if that all of a sudden the wheat fields die, you're screwed. Likewise, I'm a bit, worried about places, like Silicon Valley, which I think is essentially a one crop economy with different strands growing there, but still one crop. Look what happened with Detroit, which, in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s was this very vibrant city, but it was largely in the car industry and automotive businesses. And if that goes south, the city went south. But in a lot of these places that I looked at, you had artists, you had philosophers, you had scientists, and it makes it more vibrant because they sort of feed off each other, even though they're different fields. But I'll be honest, one thing that worries me today is the increase of specialization. That the reason we don't see a Renaissance man or woman today is because we don't really encourage it. What's rewarded is to know, more and more about less and less. And that's not the way of the genius. The genius is almost always interdisciplinary to at least some extent. Einstein was a physicist, but he was well-read. He played the violin, played it very well, and often spoke about how if he was stuck on an equation, he would go play the violin for an hour. And this is according to his son. And all of a sudden he would find the solution that way.
Well, and speaking about specialization, I've spoken to a ton of people. I've done over 2,000 podcasts in the past 3 years, and I found that very few people want to speculate outside their field. They'll say, "Oh, I'm not an expert in that," or they just won't want.
Yeah, I think that's first of all, that's a ridiculous number of podcasts. That's pretty impressive. So I'll give you. Okay, so you're prolific, definitely, and that's one thing geniuses have in common is they're prolific. They produce more good stuff and more bad stuff, but just more stuff. But to get to your point, I mean, I think that's a real problem because it's sort of, there's a book out, I believe, called The Death of Expertise, which on the one hand is going on, but there's also the tyranny of expertise and of specialization. And there's this notion that if you're not an expert, and I'm doing air quotes right now, but you can't see this because it's a podcast. If you're not an expert on some field, then you have no right to say anything about it, to explore it, to have an opinion of it. And I think that's a huge mistake. And I think one reason we saw, so much interdisciplinary genius in the past is because you could cross lines. In the 18th century, there wasn't really science. There was natural philosophy, which is what today we'd call science. And that included mathematics, astronomy, and everything. And now, especially in academia, at university campuses, you can't turn left or right 2 degrees without stepping on another department's toes and being bashed for it. And I think this is a real problem.
So you've run into that too, that people seem to be either afraid or unwilling or unable to speculate outside of their narrow field?
Well, I mean, so I've been a journalist for 20, 30 years and a full-time author for 10 years. So I've interviewed and talked to a lot of people, probably even more than the 2,000 you've done.
Sure.
Yeah, and I am always wary of people who say, well, that's not my field. I can't really, or I'm no expert, but, I'm more impressed by people who are willing to go out on a limb and willing to step into other areas. And I think we, just like we can self-censor ourselves, when it comes to speech, we can self-censor what we think about. We can say, well, I can't really think about physics because I'm not a physicist. I can't even wrestle with those problems. A book I just finished writing that we published in May is the Socrates Express. And it's a fun book about philosophy, which people have a hard time wrapping their minds around, because philosophy, unfortunately, is one of those subjects that people think is just hard and it's for experts. And that's not the way it started. Philosophy means one who loves wisdom, and we all can love wisdom. And just to go back to ancient Greece one more time, everybody could go to the agora, the marketplace, and philosophize with Socrates or talk science with Democritus or whoever. And it was much more wide open.
Well, I guess, yeah, I don't know. I guess there's a back and forth. Like now, sure, there are people that are afraid to say anything if they're not an expert, but then maybe a couple hundred years ago in many societies, there was a class system. So the thoughts or opinions of, let's say, the lower class would just be completely discarded because they weren't gentlemen or they weren't, whatever you want to call it. So maybe the same thing has been going on just in different ways. And I don't know, maybe there was a golden era of exploration and philosophy and open talk, or maybe there wasn't. I don't know.
No, I mean, I had not thought of that, but there have always been restrictions on who can talk about what, probably since the first caveman who said, what do you know about fire? You didn't invent fire. Why are you talking about fire? Or down the road invented fire. He's the expert. I mean, probably been for a long time. And you're right, for different reasons, classes or you were a slave or whatever. But if I can just, ties into something here. Another ingredient in these places is they tend to be crossroads, right? They tend to have, if not open borders, more open borders. And however you feel about the current debate about immigration, the fact is that immigrants are good for creative genius. A disproportionate number of geniuses were immigrants or refugees or both, be it Einstein or Victor Hugo, Marie Curie. And today, something like a quarter of all the Nobel Prizes are, if not more, are awarded to Americans who were not born in this country, who immigrated. And I think the reason why immigrants, maybe you have a theory, but I have my theory too, about why immigrants are disproportionately creative geniuses. And the typical theory, to sort of go back to your Korean bodegas or Korean grocery stores in New York, is, they're very hardworking. Immigrants are hungry for success, whatever their ethnicity, right? And so that, at first people said that explains. And I thought about that. I thought, well, that would explain why they maybe become successful or even wealthy. But when you're talking about creative genius, and that's what I mean here, creative breakthroughs, you need more than just hard work, right? You need new, fresh ideas. And the immigrant, by nature of their experience, has been and is exposed to new ideas. And they need to then occupy a space that I call insider-outsider space. They're outsiders, but they're inside enough to affect the system. To be an African-American slave in the 17th, 18th century, rather, in this country, you're too far outside the system. You have fresh ideas maybe, but no one's going to listen to you. And if you're too embedded in the system, if you're captain of the ship, you're not going to rock the boat either. Take someone like Freud. He was an immigrant to Vienna, came from a place called Moravia that's now part of, I believe, either the Czech Republic or Slovakia. I think Slovakia. And don't quote me on that. Anyway, he was an immigrant to Vienna, and he was a Jew. So he was an outsider in two ways. But at the time, in the early 20th century, he was inside enough that people listened to his ideas and took him seriously. And that's the sweet spot, I think.
Yeah, I guess you can encapsulate a few factors that lead to genius. I would say one is definitely adversity, but not insurmountable adversity, but enough to toughen you, harden you, and maybe give you the impetus to look for something different or better. And then, like you said, being an immigrant, being in a new place, new culture,
right?
New everything,
bringing your old ways too. I mean, I like to. And it doesn't mean that you're going to, it's not like so clear that because you're an immigrant, say from, whatever country you come to America, and you're going to say, well, back in Nigeria or in Norway or wherever, this is the way we did it. It's more just shaking things loose. Like if you were living in some small town in America and you had never seen anything but a fork and knife, as far as you were concerned, that's the only way to eat food is with a fork and knife. And a Chinese family moves in next door and you notice they're using these chopsticks to eat their food. And you're like, huh. Now, you're very unlikely to start using chopsticks to eat your food. But on some level, you've been shaken up and you're thinking, well, if there's a different way of eating my food, maybe there's a different way of composing music or farming the land or whatever it is. So it's what psychologists call a schema violation, which sounds nasty, but isn't. It's just when the regular order of things is shaken up a bit, it has this kind of multiplier creative effect. And there's studies that show this. They show videos to people of a schema violation, people having pancakes for dinner or making a sandwich in backwards order, weird stuff. And then they give them a creative thinking exam, and they see this boost in creative thinking just by watching other people do weird stuff.
Yeah, and then there's always people's reaction to it, which would color how someone would either, I guess, they might put their genius away. They might, not let it out if they're in an environment that appears to be very repressive to new and different ideas. I mean, some ideas people like and they think they're cool and quirky, and some they hang the person or they burn them at the stake for. So
well, that's why it's all about timing. That's why when I say, genius is a social verdict, that's what I mean. It's like you have the wrong idea at the wrong time, and you might either be burned at the stake or worse, ignored, but we don't see it that way. We have this very romantic idea of genius as sort of, that Mozart is a good musician, not because people think he's a good musician, but just independently of that. His music is just good. But what if his music is good the way, it's almost like fashion. For a while in the 1970s, people thought really wide ties and bell-bottom jeans and shag carpeting, all this stuff was cool and fashionable, and now we think it's silly. Genius actually operates much the same way, I think.
Are you interested much in the lives of the geniuses themselves, or is it more in how they were shaped?
Well, ultimately, I was interested in the lives, the sort of biography of the places, but I certainly looked at their lives. And we talked about adversity. They all had some degree of adversity. A hugely disproportionate number lost a parent, usually a father at a young age, when they were 3, 4, 5 years old. It's a remarkable number. And you have to wonder about that, about what is going on there. And geniuses tend to be either an only child or the older child, but often an only child. And that's another commonality.
I guess what about when their immediate family, do they seem to be affected by them or not really? And
in terms of exposure, like, are they exposed to a wide breadth of ideas at a young age? That seems to make a difference. More than having loving parents. Was it Oscar? Somebody who said, I wish I didn't remember who it was, who said the worst thing that that can happen to a budding genius is to have 2 loving parents. That's the absolute worst thing. There needs to be some tension there. Unfortunately, most parents oblige and are not perfect, of course. So there's always, I don't really know anyone who had a perfectly happy childhood. Do you?
Oh, of course, but I see what you mean. Again, it's a different kind of adversity. Not having one parent or both, not having any siblings. I can see how all that would shape someone in a different way.
Well, you also enter the adult world younger, but still with the eyes of a child, and you have to compensate for the loss, right? And of course, I should also say that if you lose a parent figure, a father figure in particular at a young age, you also might be more prone to mental illness like depression and other problems. So it works both ways.
Have you ever looked at like idiot savants? I mean, it seems like they're involuntary and geniuses are voluntary. Any point in looking there?
Well, I make a pretty sharp distinction between talent and genius. And an idiot savant may have a particular talent, but I wouldn't call them a genius, not as I define it. I think the best distinction I've heard is from the philosopher Schopenhauer. He said that talent hits the target no one else can hit. Genius hits the target no one else can see. And I think that is the distinction. So an idiot savant maybe can run numbers quickly or do these amazing feats, but we don't remember them. And this is why we often confuse IQ and genius. A genius, in my mind, is not someone with a high IQ. There are plenty of people with members of the Mensa Society with IQs over 200 who you've never heard of and will never hear of. And then there are Nobel Prize winners with lower than average IQs, many of them, and many with average IQs. So I don't think that IQ is at all really related to the kind of genius that I'm talking about.
What about the immediate family members of a genius? Their kids, their wives, husbands, etc. Are they affected, or is it just kind of like, that person was their family member, but it didn't really affect their life much?
Well, a lot of unhappy relationships out there. I'm thinking of certainly a social and political genius like Mahatma Gandhi as just one example, who had a very rocky relationship with his wife and with his children, and admitted he was a lousy father. He said as much, father of the nation, but not a great father to his children. So there's often a price to be paid in the family of a genius. Disruption, distraction, there are exceptions, I suppose, but it seems to be they are exceptions.
And I guess genius is not heritable, it appears to be. It seems to end with that person and begin with them.
It does. There's never been one genius who begot another. Never been one genius who gave birth to another genius. Again, not talking high IQ or just, smart like daddy. I'm talking, Einstein's kids were not Einstein. And Freud did have a child, Anna Freud, who became a psychologist and a pretty good one, but not like her father. So maybe it is just, tough acts to follow. But also maybe, the genetics change a bit, of course, but the time and the place also change as well. And that moment where the genius achieved geniushood has passed.
Do you try to seek out living geniuses and talk to them and interview them and learn from them, or are you looking more at historical ones?
I find it's really hard. First of all, anyone who says they're a genius is not, just like anyone who says they're a hero. You never see an interview after someone saves someone from a burning building. They always say, I just did what anyone would have done. I'm not a hero. I'd like to see the guy who says, it's remarkable. Nobody would have done what I've done. I'm a hero, I tell you.
Right, yeah.
So same thing with geniuses. And also you need, a question I often ask when I give talks on this subject, in a room full of people, I just ask the question, was Steve Jobs a genius, yes or no? So I'll ask you, was Steve Jobs a genius?
I don't know. I don't think so. I just think he just had an eye for product design, but I don't think so.
Tends to split 50-50. Unless I'm in Silicon Valley, then it's like 90% of the people say, yes, he was a genius. And I think it's because it's too soon, number one, and look at his field with technology. I mean, can you name a classical composer living today who's great, who's a genius? And why would that be that we have, Steve Jobs as a possible genius, but no classical composers? It's not that the classical composers have gotten worse and the technology is better. It's that this is what we honor, and the epigraph in my opening quote in my book kind of says it all. It's from Plato. It's what he said, what's honored in a country is cultivated there. And we honor technology. We honor not classical music or literature necessarily, but what Steve Jobs did and what his successors are doing in Silicon Valley. So if you were to just walk down the street and say, name a current living genius, most people would say, well, Steve Jobs passed away, but they might point to Elon Musk as an example, for instance. I think it's too soon to tell. And that's why, I mean, I'm definitely interested in talking to wise people. And my new book out in May is about wisdom. But as far as like pointing to geniuses here and now today, that's tough. I mean, we need a little bit of distance.
Well, I can tell you, sometimes on a given subject, I'll interview 100 different companies or people. And I do find that in any subject, whatever it is, like 95% of the people are okay. They're enough to be licensed or competent. And, this won't add up to 100, by the way, but 5% are good. They go above and beyond and they're pretty good at what they do. And then there's that 0.1 or 0.01% that are like amazing at what they do. And I can find them usually if I get into a subject long enough and speak to enough people. And when I speak to those people, I mean, and I guess like you're right, society wouldn't say they're geniuses, but they definitely seem to be, at least in what they do. And I can hear it pretty early on in the conversation. It's
right.
It's cool
and
to experience that.
Yeah. And it's, I know what you're talking about. I don't think it's genetics, or I don't think they have better genes or work harder than their colleagues necessarily, but that they see things a bit differently. It's geniuses are not know-it-alls, they're see-it-alls, or at least see things differently. And it's that slightly angular vision that makes them stand out, I think. Because, Einstein was not the most knowledgeable physicist of his day. There were physicists who knew more than he did, but they didn't know the way he did. And, and unfortunately today we really are confused. We confuse information with knowledge and knowledge with wisdom, and we think that if you just have more information, this will solve problems. And in fact, more information creates problems often. And even more knowledge doesn't solve problems. What you need is wisdom. And I think we've lost sight of that, the idea that it's not knowing more, but seeing more that matters.
Well, I think it's even worse than that. It's like a lot of people are now saying, all right, we're going to leave the wisdom to AI. And AI, I don't think, has any wisdom. And like you said, it's the vast accumulation of data, let's say, that it can look at. But it just seems like a lot of fields are saying, oh, AI will solve this, or AI will.
Right. And the reason, it's sort of like a natural, I'm just thinking about this now, it's sort of a natural outcome. That attitude is a natural outcome of our belief that wisdom is just a bunch of data. And if the machines can have all that data and process it more quickly even than a human, then they will be more knowledgeable and even wiser than us. And again, wisdom is the discerning use of knowledge. It's not having more knowledge. It's been said that, knowledge is knowing that a tomato is a fruit. Wisdom is not putting it in a fruit salad. And so, we've lost this. I'm trying in some small way in my books and in my new book, which I keep mentioning, the Socrates Express, which will be out in May, to recover that lost art of philosophy as the love of wisdom. And I think we're hungry for it. People are really hungry for wisdom, but I think they're confused because they've got these devices called smartphones they're carrying around that, and I'm fondling mine right now, which, has all of human knowledge essentially, in this little device, which is remarkable. But it's not making me any happier really, or any wiser. In fact, it's probably making me less happy. So there you go.
Well, very cool, Eric. We covered a lot of great ideas. So
we did.
Let me, for listeners, so how can they get more of your knowledge, wisdom, information, whatever you want to call it, the amalgamation of all those things? What are some of the books that they can go to, and where can they get them?
Okay. Well, my first book was A Geography of Bliss, One Grump's Search for the Happiest Places in the World. And that is out at your local bookstore. It's been 10 years, but it's still doing quite well. And if you want to go to Amazon, you can, of course, find it there as well. I wrote a book called Man Seeks God about my flirtations with the divine. And I wrote, of course, A Geography of Genius, Lessons from the World's Most Creative Places. I have a website, ericweinerbooks.com. Follow me on Twitter, Eric_Weiner. And and if I haven't mentioned, I have a new book coming out in May, The Socrates Express, a fun book, I promise, about philosophy.
Okay, well, excellent. Eric, it's been really good to talk to you. I appreciate
Yes,
you coming here.
We covered a lot of ground, and I appreciate your questions.
You're listening to the Future Tech Health Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Until I reached age 40, I never realized the obvious, that we all have medical issues, or we at least have a family member or close relation that has, or will have them in the future. Medicine and biological systems are the final frontier. Until we've conquered death, figured out how life began, cured cancer, and understood our purpose in the universe, there's a heck of a lot to talk about when it comes to our health. Future Tech Health means I'll be covering futuristic topics that are actually already in clinical trials, or even starting to appear on shelves or by prescription, or available for your own use. We dive deep into stem cells, CRISPR-Cas9, the science of sleep, epigenetics, medical testing, cancer, ketogenic diets, stem cells, aging, regenerative medicine, and more. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a serious medical problem. Remember, however, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you enjoyed the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and share it with friends. Thank you.